Sorry.
It's saying, oh, I'm an old hand at this now. Okay, in 3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Navigating Net Zero in partnership with Arete Zero Carbon. I'm Sarah Ural, consulting editor at CRN, and I'm delighted once again to be joined by Arete Zero Carbon's managing director, Dr. Stephen Finnegan. Hello again, Steve.
Hi, Sarah. Good morning.
So last episode, we looked at scope 1 and 2 emissions and why they matter. But this week, we're touching on the mammoth in the 3 series, scope 3. This affects every part of the supply chain and every company does need to be aware of it. So I will stop talking and I will hand over to the expert. So Steve, if we go to our first question, what is scope 3 and what does it mean for the channel?
So thanks for the question, Sarah. So let's jump straight in then to scope 3. I you just used that word behemoth, which is what it is really. So scope 3, let's be clear on what the definition is. So scope 3 emission is an independent emission. Sorry, not independent at all. It's an indirect emission that a company is responsible for. So that's what the definition is. So it's something that the company does not produce itself. So that's typically every single other activity of a business from its upstream and its downstream processes. And scope 3 has been cleverly articulated and designed by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We covered that off last week. There are 15 categories in scope 3, starting with category 1, which is purchasing goods and services, right the way through to category 15, which is investments. So if you're a business who obviously purchases a huge sum of goods and services, then scope 3, category 1 will be very important to you. If you're a bank, for example, or someone who works in the finance, then category 15 investments becomes your most dominant feature. By way of example, the work we did with KFC, category 14 is franchisees, and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol under scope 3, it's just a guide. So the University of Oxford recently undertook their own scope 3 assessment and actually added a category. They added category 16, which was student travel. So it's there as a guide in terms of scope 3, and it's important. What's it mean for the channel? Well, it's very important for the channel because, as we know, everyone in the channel is linked. So the vendors, these resellers, ITADs, end customers, so on. We're all in this loop together, and scope 3 absolutely dwarfs all the emissions from scope 1 and 2. So if companies don't measure scope 3, there's a lot of ramifications for that because of the regulations and what's happening. We cover that in session 2 and 3. But also, if you just report on scope 1 and 2, you're missing the big picture, really, scope 3.
So who takes responsibility for scope 3 emissions across the supply chain, and where do you even start measuring?
Right. We mentioned this again previously, just a little quote. If every business reduced the scope 1 and 2 to 0, there would be no scope 3. Mm-hmm. So that's obviously an important statement to make. This sort of concept of responsibility across the IT channel, it hasn't been addressed. This is all my own personal opinion, really. And we could ask the question, who's to blame in inverted commas, if you want to use that word, blame. We could ask further questions. Is it the vendors for not creating products which aren't 100% recyclable and aren't environmentally friendly? You could say, is it the disties and the resellers because they just get kit in and sell it on without, should they do more? Are the ITADs the saviors? Are they the group that's going to help, change this, and they're taking responsibility, they're doing more? Or are we all to blame, really, as consumers for demanding new, updated, upgraded products on an almost daily basis? So I think the answer to the question of who takes responsibility is that we all have a role to play, really. And it's difficult, but I think we all have some role to play if we look at it from that way. To answer the second part of the question, how do we start to measure this? Well, what we can do is take a very, very basic approach to measuring your scope 3 impact. And the way in which we can do that is to use financial data. So if you know how much you've spent on goods and services, if you know how much you've spent on transportation, blah, 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 you can use what's called a spend-based method of assessment, which is very and wholly inaccurate to do that. But it's a starting point, and many companies have started, and that's what they do, spend-based. What you can then do is move on to a much more advanced level of measurement called a supplier-specific method. So that's when you're able to obtain what's called PCFs, or product carbon footprints, of an item that's bought and sold. So I know firsthand a lot of the disties and resellers and the vendors. Well, the vendors are creating PCFs. There's tens of thousands of them now, and the disties and resellers are obtaining them so that the end users and then customers know what they're buying and have an idea of what they're buying. But we need to move away from spend-based modeling to supplier-specific methods of assessment.
That leads on to the next question quite nicely. Should distributors, resellers, and end customers hold their vendors accountable and encourage them to make the necessary changes first?
Well, ultimately, it's the vendors that are the, what's the word, custodians of this bit of kit, really. You know, we sat here now looking at laptops and monitors around us that were created by vendors, of course. So they obviously have a significant role to play. And, you know, the likes of Dell, HP, Lenovo, Apple, and many others, in fairness to them, you know, they do create PCFs, product carbon footprints, and you can go onto the Apple website or HP or Dell, anyone, and you can see those now. They're all there, they're all live, updated, and they are making good progress. It's not, you know, since this was all highlighted in the last 5 or 10 years, you know, that they are making significant change. They're moving away from virgin materials and looking at recycled cobalt, for example, and to create PCBs. Of course, they could do more. And of course, we can have better buyback schemes and we can do other things. But I think it's fair to say that the vendors should, and they do, in fairness, they look at continuous improvement planning. And I think they'll have to, through the regulations and through customer demand, they're going to have to do more. And to give one quick example, which we've discussed in the past, but the idea of digital product passports, so DPPs. Now they're likely to come in across Europe in 2026 for consumer electronics, and a digital product passport is a PCF, product carbon footprint. So whether the vendors are, whether they want to do it or whether they should be doing it, there's a whole discussion and debate. But I think we'd all agree that they could probably do a little bit more, if that's fair to say. But it has changed significantly in the last 5-10 years.
Again, that leads on really nicely to the next question. What should the industry as a whole be doing better to really tackle this issue? What do they need to do?
Well, I can only really talk about my experience, Sarah, and from all the different companies that we've worked with, you know, it's just, you know, 20, 30 companies plus. The trends that I see are this, really, in terms of what the industry needs to do better and how it can tackle the issue. What I've done, I've just got a short list I'm going to read off here of 5 different things that I think the industry could do better. Okay. Firstly, I think every business across the channel, no matter the size, scale, needs to understand scope 1, 2, and 3. That's just a given. You know, they've got to get their heads around what the scopes are. They've got to give some measurements. They've got to do something. And that's the second point, really, is that they need to measure their impact as accurately as they possibly can. Now, if it's spend-based modeling, okay, let's do that in year one, but let's move away from that as we progress. But they have to understand it. Firstly, secondly, they have to measure it. Thirdly, and this will come through legislation such as CSRD, they're going to have to publicly disclose what they do. That's what I think will happen over the next 5 years. And I think the bigger companies should publicly disclose. I think people need to know more about what they do and what impact they have. So that's the third piece. The fourth, penultimate one really is that every business, when they've completed those steps, they do need a cost-effective decarbonisation plan. And people are often put off by this, by having the plan thinking, well, it's going to cost a load of money that we haven't got. We're on tight margins anyway, blah, blah, blah. That's why I've used the word cost-effective, because there are things that can be done. There are changes you could do and frameworks and contracts and things that don't have any financial impact will have a huge impact on how much carbon your company emits. And then lastly, really, it's when you have that plan in place, it's about implementation. We've seen everywhere businesses with fantastic ideas, fantastic decarbonisation roadmaps and plans, but then a year on, the emissions have gone up, or 2 years on, part of a merger, an acquisition, they've become part of a big company, and that plan's lost or something happens. So it's a continuous improvement and a continuous, and then we need the training and the guidance, of course, that everyone needs, and this is why this platform and these videos just go some way to help with that, with those 5 steps.
Yeah, everything we can do to help. Absolutely. And I know you've kind of touched on it, but there was a sort of conversation about it in another meeting about some new developments potentially for the greenhouse gas protocol. When do you think that'll be? Do you think it'll be anything significant? Should anyone be kind of aware of it?
Yeah, so just for clarity, Sarah, the GHG protocol is about to change, and there'll be a version 2 of the guidance released. The latest that we've heard from the World Resources Institute, who administer the GHG protocol, that's just gone out to public consultation. The feedback is back from the public. The public were given the opportunity to comment on the protocol. For example, the 15 categories in scope 3, that's not enough. We need category 16. Some of the categories are confused with elements of scope 2. There was a whole series of questions, whole series of answers. So all that came back, and the latest we've heard is that that's all being sort of analysed and considered, and then there will be an update. Now, I don't expect the update to be dramatic or to change a lot. I think the 15 categories will remain in scope 3. I think the way in which you measure carbon, from spend-based to supply-specific methods, will probably stay the same. I think there'll just be a few of the sort of nuance pieces will be taken out, and a few other bits and pieces will go in, but I don't expect any substantial change to something that's been in place since 2001. There won't be any wholesale changes, I don't feel, but that should come out the end of this year or Q1 of next year, and then we'll see what happens. Just to re-emphasize that for the IT space, I don't think there'll be anything in there around IT. I think the IT industry still needs its own sector guidance on that, really. But that's the latest.
Yeah,
that's where we are.
Okay, well, that's covered scope 3 in quite a lot of detail. I'm sure there's plenty more that we'll be discussing. I'm sure we'll come back to it at a later episode. And as I've always said, anyone that's got any questions, we're here. Steve is quite willing to answer them, so do get in touch. Next month, I think we're going to be covering carbon reduction planning, or CRP, because we need another acronym, and how you can achieve those solutions. So just ends to say thanks, Steve. Thanks for trying to make such a difficult and complex subject a little easy to understand.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next one.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Bye.
Thanks. Bye now.